The night was calm at first. The sky carried a heavy silence, and only the soft rustle of wind touched the small town that rested beside the wide river. Families were finishing dinner, children were laughing somewhere in the distance, and shopkeepers were closing their shutters after a long day. No one could imagine that by morning everything they knew would be washed away. The air changed around midnight. The wind grew stronger, whispering warnings that few understood. Clouds gathered like a dark army above the town, and rain began to fall, not the kind that comes softly and ends in an hour, but sheets of water pouring down with a force that made the ground tremble. The river, usually calm and friendly, began to roar like an angry beast. Within hours, the calm town turned into a place of fear. One by one, lights went out as the electricity failed. People peeked through their windows, trying to see through the storm. The rain made the streets look like mirrors reflecting flashes of lightning. Dogs barked, cows moaned in the distance, and a few men ran from house to house, shouting for others to wake up. "The river is rising. Get to higher ground," they cried. But many didn't believe it could reach them. The river had flooded before, yes, but never like this. Near the edge of the town, a woman held her 2 children close. Her husband had gone outside to check the water level, promising he'd be back in a few minutes. Minutes passed, then an hour. The water had reached her doorstep now, pushing small objects around her floor. She tried calling his phone, but the signal was gone. All she could hear was the thunder above and the rushing sound of water closing in. On another street, an old man sat by the window of his small wooden house. He had lived there his whole life and had seen storms come and go. But this time he felt something different, a strange heaviness in his chest that wasn't just fear, but disbelief. The rain was not stopping. It had already covered half his porch. When he looked outside, he saw a floating bicycle, a broken chair, and the faint glow of a lantern drifting away. He whispered to himself, "This river has gone mad." By 3 a.m, the first cries for help began. People climbed onto rooftops shouting into the dark. The rain drowned their voices, but they kept calling. A few younger men formed a line, helping neighbors out of their flooded homes. They carried old people on their backs, past children, from one roof to another, and used doors and plastic drums as makeshift boats. The smell of wet mud, wood, and fear filled the air. At the town center, a small temple stood on slightly higher ground. It quickly became a refuge for many. Families gathered there, shivering and wet, holding each other close. Mothers tried to calm their children, whispering, "It will be okay," even when they themselves didn't believe it. A few people brought whatever they could: candles, dry clothes, bottles of water. Everyone shared. There was no space for pride or difference that night, only survival. Outside, the river was no longer a river. It was a sea. The sound of it crashing against walls and trees was louder than thunder. Pieces of wood, roofs, and even cars floated past. Every now and then someone shouted a name into the dark, hoping for an answer. Sometimes a voice came back, sometimes it didn't. The fear of not knowing where loved ones were was heavier than the rain itself. As dawn began to break, the rain finally slowed, but the destruction was already beyond imagination. The town was half underwater, roads had disappeared, houses had tilted or collapsed, and in the middle of that silent ruin stood people, cold, barefoot, covered in mud, but alive. Some cried in relief, others stared blankly at what used to be their homes. The woman who had waited for her husband still held her children close on the temple floor. Her eyes searched every face that entered, hoping he would appear through the doorway. The old man from the wooden house had been rescued by a group of boys who found him clinging to a window frame. He sat quietly, holding a small tin box that contained the only things he managed to save: some photographs and an old wristwatch. Around him, strangers offered him dry cloth and biscuits, but he barely spoke. Everywhere there were small stories of loss and courage. A young man had saved 3 people by breaking open a window. A girl had swum across a flooded alley with her grandmother tied to her back. 2 shop owners had opened their stores for anyone who needed shelter, not caring about money or property anymore. In that chaos, humanity was already showing its first signs of light. By afternoon, the rain returned, Not as fierce as before, but enough to remind everyone that they were still in danger. Some people climbed trees to get a better view of the roads, hoping to spot help coming their way. But all they saw was water stretching as far as the eye could see. There was no sound of rescue boats, no helicopters, no sirens. Only silence, broken by the cries of children and the occasional splash of something falling into the water. Yet, among all that, no one gave up. The men who had been helping through the night decided to keep going. They tied ropes between trees to make a path, guiding others to the temple. They shared every dry piece of bread they could find. A woman tore her shawl into strips to bandage someone's injured leg. A teacher who had lost his house kept the children busy by telling them stories about brave people who survived storms. He smiled even when tears filled his eyes. When evening came, the sky turned a strange orange-gray. The rain stopped, and for the first time, the sound of birds returned. It was quiet, too quiet. People stepped outside carefully, looking at what was left. The main road was gone. The marketplace looked like a lake. Cows and goats wandered aimlessly, searching for food. But there was something stronger than the destruction that filled the air now, something invisible but real. It was the will to survive. A few people gathered near what used to be the bus stand. They decided to find a way to send a message outside. They had no phones working, no vehicles, and no power. But they had hope. One of them suggested climbing the hill outside the town. From there, maybe we can get a signal, he said. So two young men took the risk. They wrapped plastic around an old mobile phone, took a bottle of water, and started walking through knee-deep mud toward the hill. The climb was slow and painful. The path was slippery and each step felt like a battle. But when they reached the top, they saw the full picture of what had happened. The entire valley looked like an ocean, with rooftops poking out of the water. Smoke rose from a few spots where people were trying to start fires for warmth. It was heartbreaking, and yet they knew they had to act. They found a weak mobile signal. One of them typed a short message and posted it online. It said, "Our town is underwater. Hundreds stranded. We need help urgently." Then they waited. The signal blinked once, twice, and then the message went through. Neither of them knew that in just a few hours, those words would spread far beyond what they imagined. It would reach people they had never met, people who would soon come running with food, boats, and medicine. But for now, they simply sat on the hill watching their broken town below and whispering prayers. Back at the temple, the woman was still waiting. The old man still clutching his tin box, the children still holding on to hope. The night came again, but this time it was not silent. It was filled with whispers of strength. People shared stories of how they had helped each other. Some even laughed softly as if to remind themselves that life was still there, still breathing. In that darkness, surrounded by water and uncertainty, the people had nothing left. No electricity, no food, no homes. But they had something that the flood could never take away, the power of standing together. They didn't know it yet, but their call for help had already begun its journey. And soon that call would be heard. The storm that had come to destroy them would bring another kind of storm, a storm made of kindness, courage, and humanity itself. The morning sun rose behind thick clouds, pale and tired, as if even the sky had lost its strength. The storm had passed, but silence was heavier than the rain that had fallen all night. Across the flooded town, smoke curled up from small fires people had made to dry their clothes and warm their hands. The smell of wet earth and burnt wood filled the air. On the hill, the two young men who had climbed through the mud still sat beside the single phone they had managed to connect. The battery was almost gone, but they kept refreshing the screen, waiting for a reply to the message they had sent hours ago. Down below, people were beginning to move around again, trying to clean the mess or find missing ones. The woman with the two children was helping to distribute dry biscuits that someone had saved in a tin box. The old man, still holding his tin box of memories, sat nearby and watched as small groups of people began to plan their next steps. The message from the hill slowly began to travel. First, a few people saw it online. A simple post with a picture of water covering rooftops and the words, "Our town is underwater. Hundreds stranded. We need help urgently." It was only a few lines, but it carried the weight of 1,000 voices. Within minutes, people started to share it. Someone living in the nearby city forwarded it to friends. A local journalist picked it up and posted it again. Soon it reached community groups, rescue forums, and even the attention of officials. Phones began to ring in faraway towns. "Have you seen this?" "They need help," strangers said to each other. Drivers who owned small trucks offered to carry supplies. College students started collecting food, water, and blankets. A few fishermen living near the coast prepared their boats to travel upstream. It was like a wave of kindness beginning to rise from every direction. Back in the flooded town, no one knew this was happening yet. They were too busy surviving. People were sharing the last pieces of food, filtering rainwater to drink, and comforting children who kept asking, "When will help come?" Every hour felt like a day, but still they tried to stay strong. At the temple, one of the young men returned from the hill to tell everyone. The message went out. Maybe someone will see it. His voice was tired but hopeful. People listened quietly, and for the first time since the disaster began, there was a tiny spark of relief in their eyes. They didn't clap or cheer, they simply nodded, holding on to that small piece of hope like a lifeline. Meanwhile, miles away, a group of volunteers in another district loaded their vehicles. They had seen the message and couldn't sit still. They gathered ropes, life jackets, medicines, and packets of food. None of them knew exactly how to reach the town, because most roads were damaged, but that didn't stop them. "We'll find a way," one of them said, tightening the rope around a bundle of supplies. By evening, the news of the disaster had spread even further. Television channels began showing the image of the submerged town. People sitting in their homes miles away were shocked. Many had never heard of this small town before, but seeing the destruction on the screen made their hearts ache. Donation drives started. Social groups began collecting funds and materials. Some people prayed. Others decided to go in person to help. In the dark temple, as the second night came, the people gathered around small lamps made from bits of oil and cotton. The children were sleepy, the elders weak, but nobody gave up. They talked softly about the life they had before the flood, the markets, the schools, the laughter in the evenings, and how it would all come back one day. The woman who had lost contact with her husband looked at her children and whispered, "People will come. We just have to wait a little longer." The sound of rain had gone, replaced by the constant dripping of water from rooftops and the distant creak of wood moving in the current. Then, just before midnight, someone thought they heard a faint motor sound. At first, everyone froze. They listened again. The sound came and went, soft and far. Some said it was only the wind, but others stood up and climbed onto the roof to look. The night was too dark to see anything, but deep down, everyone wanted to believe that help was finally on its way. At sunrise, the sound came again, louder this time. The old man was the first to spot it. A small rescue boat slowly making its way through the flooded street. The boat looked tiny against the endless water, but it was the most beautiful sight they had ever seen. People began to shout and wave their arms, calling out. The rescuers waved back, shouting directions. Within minutes, the temple area turned into a scene of relief and tears. The rescuers brought dry food, bottled water, and first aid supplies. They listened carefully as the townspeople told them about those still missing. "We'll go back and bring more help," one rescuer promised. "More teams are coming. People are on their way from everywhere." The woman who had waited for her husband asked if they had seen a man trapped near the riverside. The rescuer shook his head softly but told her not to lose hope. "We'll keep searching," he said gently. She nodded, holding her children closer. The rescuers couldn't stay long. The current was still strong and their fuel was limited. They marked the safest routes and promised to return soon with more boats. When they left, people stood watching until the sound of the engine faded again. But this time they were not afraid. They knew someone had heard their call. Back in the city, the message had become a storm of its own. News channels were broadcasting live updates, volunteers were forming lines to donate goods, and social media was filled with people asking, "How can we help?" Hospitals were preparing for injured survivors. Schools offered their buildings as shelters. Even children helped by packing boxes of clothes and writing small notes of love and encouragement to send with the supplies. By afternoon, a convoy of trucks began moving toward the flooded region. Roads were damaged and bridges broken, but drivers refused to turn back. In some places, they got down to push the vehicles through mud. At one broken bridge, locals from another village had built a makeshift wooden path just to let the trucks pass. Everyone, even those who weren't affected, felt connected by a single purpose: to help those in need. Inside the flooded town, people started cleaning small patches of ground that were finally visible. As water began to lower slightly, they built temporary fires to boil water, dried whatever food they had left, and took turns keeping watch for more rescue boats. Children collected floating wood pieces to make seats and shelves. The community spirit was growing stronger by the hour. Then came the most beautiful sight yet: a line of boats, one after another, coming through the main street, loaded with supplies and smiling faces. Some boats carried medical teams. Others had volunteers with food packets and blankets. They came from different cities, different regions, even different languages, but all with one heart. The people on the rooftops clapped and cried at the same time. Help had not only arrived, it had arrived like a storm of kindness. The rescuers began to move from house to house. They lifted elderly people into boats, gave water to children, and comforted those who had lost their belongings. One man who had lost everything looked at the volunteers and said softly, "You are strangers, but you came for us. You are our family now." A volunteer smiled and replied, "We are all family when humanity calls." The woman who had been waiting since the first night finally saw something that made her heart skip. One of the boats was bringing survivors from the far side of the river, and among them she spotted a familiar shirt, her husband's. She ran toward the water, calling his name. He jumped from the boat, soaked and trembling, and they hugged tightly as their children cried with joy. Around them, others smiled, sharing the moment as if it belonged to everyone. By sunset, the temple area had turned into a relief center. Tents were being set up, food was cooking in large pots, and laughter slowly began to replace tears. The old man who had lost his house sat beside a volunteer, telling him stories about how beautiful the town used to be. The volunteer listened with respect, promising, "We'll help you rebuild it again." As darkness fell, the town glowed with the soft lights of rescue lamps and candles. The sound of engines, laughter, and distant songs mixed in the air. People who had been strangers only 2 days ago were now working together like old friends. It was hard to believe that only 48 hours earlier, they had thought no one would come. Now the world was reaching for them. On the hill where the first message had been sent, the two young men looked down at the scene below. They couldn't hold back their emotions. The town was still broken but filled with life again. One of them whispered, "We only sent one message, but look how many hearts answered." Below them, the river flowed quietly under the moonlight. The storm had destroyed much, but it had also revealed something far greater: the strength of unity, the goodness of people, and the power of a single cry for help that turned into a storm of humanity. The night ended not with fear, but with gratitude. People shared food, shared stories, and shared hope. And though they didn't know what the next day would bring, they had already learned something they would never forget. When one voice calls in pain, 1,000 others can rise in response, and that is how humanity survives. Morning came with a softer sky. The storm clouds had finally broken apart, leaving behind pale sunlight that touched the wet ground like a promise. The water had begun to lower slowly, but the streets were still muddy and filled with debris. Wooden planks, pieces of broken furniture, and torn clothes floated by. Yet for the first time in many days, people felt a little peace inside their hearts. The world had answered their call. Help had truly come. Rescue boats were still arriving from nearby towns. The sound of engines echoed across the flooded lanes, followed by voices shouting instructions and laughter. Some boats carried food packets. Others brought blankets, medicines, and clean drinking water. Each time a new boat arrived, people clapped and waved. The rescuers waved back, smiling even though they were exhausted. They had been working day and night, but none of them complained. Every face carried the same quiet determination: to save as many lives as possible. At the temple ground, which had turned into a relief camp, the scene looked completely different from the chaos of earlier days. Volunteers had set up large tents using plastic sheets and bamboo poles. Fires burned in metal drums to keep people warm. Smoke curled up into the sky, carrying the smell of cooking rice and lentils. Children, once silent from fear, now played near the edge of the camp, chasing each other barefoot through the mud. Their laughter was like music after days of silence. A group of women worked together to prepare food. They stirred big pots with long sticks, handing out bowls to whoever passed by. No one asked who belonged to which family anymore. Everyone was part of one big family now. The woman who had waited for her husband now helped to feed others. Her face, though tired, carried a calm strength. She smiled at everyone who came to eat, even offering extra portions to the elders who had lost their homes. Her husband, who had survived the flood, worked with the volunteers to clean the streets and help those still trapped in nearby houses. The old man who had been rescued from his wooden house sat under a small tent, watching everything quietly. A volunteer had given him dry clothes and a cup of warm tea. It had been years since he had seen so many people working together. Every few minutes, someone came to check on him, asking if he needed anything. He would shake his head, smile faintly, and say, "I just need to see everyone safe." Nearby, a group of young people was helping medical workers set up a small first aid station. They brought stretchers, medicines, and bandages. Some helped the injured, some carried water, and others organized lists of missing people. A local teacher began writing names on a large board so that families could find their loved ones. Each time a missing person was found alive, cheers went up around the camp. Those moments felt like small miracles. The volunteers who had come from outside didn't stop working. Some of them hadn't slept in 2 days. Their clothes were wet, their hands covered in mud, but they refused to rest. When one man offered them food, a rescuer simply smiled and said, "Let others eat first. We'll eat later." It was this spirit of selflessness that filled the whole place with hope. As the day went on, more help arrived, trucks loaded with supplies, doctors, and even reporters who wanted to show the world what was happening. But unlike the early days of chaos, now there was order and cooperation. Every person who came to help was welcomed warmly. The locals guided them through safe paths, showing where people still needed rescue. The outsiders listened carefully, respecting the experience of those who had lived through the disaster. By afternoon, the sun was shining brighter. The muddy water reflected the light like a mirror, and people could finally see the outlines of their homes again. Some began to walk back to check on their belongings. They found broken walls, ruined furniture, and soaked clothes, but they also found each other. Neighbors hugged tightly, crying and laughing at the same time. They shared stories of how they had survived, some by climbing trees, some by floating on wooden doors, and some by the kindness of strangers. One man said he had never spoken to the fisherman who lived at the edge of town before, but that fisherman had saved his life by pulling him into his boat. Another woman said she had been rescued by students from another city who didn't even know her name. Everyone had a story of someone's courage. The flood had taken many things, but it had given them something even greater, the understanding that kindness is stronger than any disaster. In the relief camp, people started organizing small tasks. Some cleaned the area, others took charge of distributing supplies. Children carried buckets of water and helped sweep the ground. It was as if everyone had suddenly become part of one big team. The sense of unity was so strong that even those who had lost everything found comfort in working side by side with others. At one corner of the camp, an old radio crackled with updates. It said that more relief was on the way: medical teams, construction materials, and volunteers from faraway cities. The townspeople listened quietly, grateful but still humble. They didn't ask for more. They only thanked whoever had sent help. Some people even sent messages back through the rescue teams saying, "Tell them we are safe now. Tell them thank you." The evening came with a golden sky. The water glimmered as the sun set behind the hills. People sat together around the fires, eating simple meals, talking softly, and sometimes laughing. For many, it was the first full meal in days. The children played nearby, their faces glowing in the firelight. One volunteer played a small drum, and soon others joined in, clapping and singing softly. The sound of music mixed with the crackling of the fire and the soft rustle of the night breeze. For a few moments, the pain and loss felt distant. Yet, deep inside, everyone knew the hardest part was still to come: rebuilding what was lost. The flood had destroyed homes, schools, and fields. The crops were gone, the shops ruined. But no one spoke of despair that night. They only spoke of what they could do next. One man said, "Tomorrow we start cleaning the main road." Another replied, "I'll help repair the school." And someone added, "We will plant again. The soil will dry and life will return." Those words carried more power than any speech. They were pure faith. Late that night, as most people slept under the tents, a few volunteers stayed awake, keeping watch. They moved quietly between the shelters, checking on families and making sure the fires didn't go out. The sky was clear now and the stars looked brighter than ever. One of the rescuers looked up and whispered to himself, "So many people suffered, but look at them now, they are still smiling." He smiled too, then went back to work, his heart full of quiet pride. By the next morning, the real work of rebuilding had already begun. People used whatever tools they could find, bamboo poles, ropes, even their bare hands to clear the debris. Some started repairing roofs. Others collected wood from fallen trees. The volunteers joined in, shoulder to shoulder. Nobody waited for instructions. Everyone just did what needed to be done. The woman who had lost her home helped to set up a small school space under a tent for the children. The old man gave advice on how to dry and reuse wooden boards. Even the smallest child wanted to help in some way. As the day went on, something beautiful began to happen. The rescuers who had come from other places started receiving calls from their families, asking if they were safe. They replied, "Yes, but we're staying here a little longer. These people are our family now." They didn't want to leave until the town could stand on its own feet again. Before sunset, the first big relief truck arrived at the edge of the main road. It carried tools, medicines, and clothes. The driver said he had traveled for 20 hours straight to get there. When he stepped out, the crowd clapped for him, and he smiled shyly, saying, "I only did what anyone would do." That simple sentence captured the spirit of everyone who had come to help. That night, the camp looked almost festive. Lanterns hung from bamboo poles, fires burned bright, and songs filled the air. People shared food, shared stories, and shared dreams for tomorrow. No one talked about fear anymore. They talked about rebuilding, about gratitude, about how strangers had become brothers and sisters. As the old man watched the scene around him, he whispered softly, "The flood came to destroy us, but it brought us together instead." The volunteer sitting beside him nodded and said, "Maybe that's how nature reminds us we're never alone." The wind blew gently through the camp, carrying the sound of laughter across the quiet water. Somewhere in the distance, another rescue team was arriving, guided by the glow of lanterns. And in that moment, it felt as if the whole world had joined hands to lift this small town from despair. The people had called for help, and help had come, not in the form of miracles, but in the form of human hearts that refused to stay still. They had survived the storm, and now, together, they were learning how to live again. The flood had tested their strength, but it had also revealed something unbreakable inside them, humanity at its purest, shining even in the darkest night. The days after the flood began to blend together. Each sunrise brought a little more light, a little more strength, and a little more hope. The town was still muddy, broken, and covered in the marks of destruction, but there was life again. Smoke rose from small cooking fires. The sound of hammers echoed from half-fallen houses, and laughter returned in small bursts, like sunshine after rain. People had stopped waiting for help. Now they were the help. The same people who had once stood on rooftops crying for rescue were now rebuilding walls, cleaning streets, and cooking for others. The rescuers and volunteers who had come from outside had become part of the community. They no longer felt like guests, they felt like family. In one corner of the relief camp, a group of young people worked tirelessly to clean the nearby school building. The flood had left behind piles of mud, broken desks, and torn books. But they refused to give up. Using shovels, buckets, and even their bare hands, they cleared the classrooms. "The children will study here again," one of them said, his face streaked with dirt but his eyes shining with determination. Others nodded and kept going. It didn't matter how long it took. The school symbolized more than learning. It symbolized normal life returning. At another part of town, women gathered near the temple ground to prepare food for everyone. They cooked in huge pots, stirring the rice with long sticks, adding spices that filled the air with warmth. There was no talk of who brought what or who owned how much. Everyone shared what little they had. A woman who had lost everything brought a small bag of salt she'd found in the debris, saying, "It's not much, but maybe it will help." They all smiled and thanked her because in that moment, every small act meant something big. Children were everywhere. Some helped by carrying small bundles of firewood. Some handed out cups of water to the workers, and others simply ran around laughing, splashing in puddles. Their laughter had a healing sound. It reminded everyone that life always finds a way to move forward. One volunteer sat with a group of kids under a tree, drawing pictures in the dirt to keep them entertained. The children listened as he told stories of brave people who had faced hard times and still found joy. Their eyes sparkled with hope. The old man who had survived the flood watched all of this quietly. He sat on a wooden bench someone had built for him outside the relief tent. Every morning, volunteers came to check on him, and every time they did, he had something wise to say. "You know," he told one young helper, "water can destroy walls, but it can't wash away kindness." The volunteer nodded, repeating his words softly like a lesson to remember. As more volunteers arrived from nearby cities, the work spread beyond the town center. They began to repair roads and clear paths leading to the nearby villages that were still cut off. Some rescuers used small boats to reach isolated families and deliver food. Others helped reconnect phone lines and power wires. Each group had its own task, but they all worked with the same purpose: to make sure no one was left behind. And then something beautiful began to happen. People from faraway towns who had only heard about the disaster on the news started sending letters, money, and boxes of supplies. Children from schools in other districts collected clothes and wrote little notes that said things like, "Stay strong," and "We are with you." When the relief truck brought these boxes to the camp, people opened them with teary smiles. Some of them couldn't believe that strangers cared so much. "We don't even know them," one woman said softly, "but they still thought of us." Every day brought a new example of kindness. A farmer from a nearby village came riding on a small tractor, carrying vegetables he had grown. "Take it," he said. "I still have food, but you have lost yours." A group of truck drivers decided to stay for a week to help carry materials. A nurse from another district came on her own, treating people for free. She slept in a tent beside the others, never complaining about the long hours. When someone thanked her, she said simply, "When one heart hurts, all hearts must answer." The spirit of togetherness grew so strong that even people who had once lived separately, by status, by job, or by background, now worked hand in hand. There were no rich or poor anymore, no divisions of any kind. Everyone wore the same mud-stained clothes, ate from the same pots, and sat side by side under the same tents. At night, after a long day of work, people gathered around small fires. They shared stories of what they had seen and lost, but also what they had gained. Some told stories of strangers who saved their lives. Others spoke of the courage they found inside themselves. One man said, "I never knew my hands could build something again after they lost everything." Another added, "Maybe this is what it means to start over, not with things, but with people." As the days passed, the town slowly began to change. The roads started to look clearer. Houses began to stand again, and green shoots appeared where the floodwater had once drowned the fields. Nature, too, was healing. Birds returned to the trees, singing softly in the mornings. The air smelled fresher, mixed with the scent of new earth and cooked food. The sound of hope was everywhere, in footsteps and laughter, in quiet prayers whispered under the stars. One afternoon, the volunteers decided to organize something special, a small community gathering to thank everyone. It wasn't a celebration in the usual sense. It was more like a moment to pause and breathe. They built a small stage out of bamboo, decorated it with flowers picked from the nearby fields, and invited everyone to sit together. When the time came, people gathered with smiles on their faces. Children sat in front clapping and giggling. One of the volunteers spoke first, saying, "We came here to help, but you are the ones who taught us what real courage looks like." Then the local people stood up one by one to thank those who came. An elderly woman said, "The flood took our homes, but it gave us something far more precious. It showed us that kindness still lives in this world." Everyone nodded and wiped away quiet tears. As the evening went on, someone began to sing. The song was soft and full of emotion. Soon others joined in, and the sound of voices rose into the open sky. It wasn't just music. It was a prayer of gratitude, a song of unity. Even those who didn't know the words hummed along, smiling at each other through the glow of the lanterns. After the song ended, silence settled over the crowd for a moment. The air was cool, the stars bright, and the river, once a monster, now flowed calmly in the distance. The people sat together, not speaking, but understanding everything without words. They had gone through something that would stay with them forever, but they were no longer broken. They were rebuilt from within. When the night grew darker, the children began to fall asleep one by one, resting their heads on their parents' laps. Volunteers covered them with blankets, and the adults whispered softly so as not to wake them. The old man looked at the scene and smiled. "Look at them," he said to a volunteer sitting beside him. "They sleep peacefully again. That means the worst is over." But even as peace returned, the work continued. There were still homes to rebuild, wells to clean, and crops to plant. Yet no one felt tired anymore. They had learned something important. When people come together, there is no challenge too big. The flood had taken away their comfort, but it had awakened their humanity. One morning, a young volunteer stood on the same hill where the first call for help had been sent. He looked down at the town and saw how far it had come. From chaos to calm, from fear to hope, from destruction to unity. He remembered the first message. "Our town is underwater. Hundreds stranded. We need help urgently." Now he whispered a new message to himself. "Our town is rising again. Hundreds united. We thank you all." He didn't send it anywhere. He just stood there smiling as the wind carried his words across the valley. Down below, the town continued to hum with life. Children's laughter echoed, hammers rang, and the smell of cooking drifted through the air. People had learned to live differently, not just for themselves, but for each other. The world had seen their pain, and the world had answered. And now they were showing the world how powerful kindness could be. The flood may have been nature's storm, but what came after was a storm of humanity, compassion, and courage. And in that rebuilt town, every heart carried the same key. The floodwaters had finally begun to fall back, slowly revealing what had been hidden for days. Muddy streets reappeared, rooftops emerged again, and the river that once roared like a wild beast now flowed quietly, almost as if it too was tired of destruction. The air was filled with a new kind of silence. Not the silence of fear, but the silence that comes after a storm, when people finally have a chance to breathe again. But as the water left, it showed the full picture of what had been lost. Houses stood half-broken, fields were buried under layers of silt, and the smell of wet wood and earth filled the air. It was a heartbreaking sight, but no one turned away. People didn't cry anymore. They just looked at the damage with calm eyes, ready to begin again. They had already survived the worst. Now came the test of rebuilding. From early morning, the sound of work echoed everywhere. People cleaned their homes, carried broken furniture out, and began fixing roofs using bamboo, tin sheets, and whatever scraps they could find. The volunteers were still there, helping side by side. No one gave orders. Everyone simply worked together like they had done it all their lives. Children formed small groups to collect scattered wood and nails. Women worked together to clean wells and wash clothes, laughing even when the water was cold and the soap was scarce. Old people sat outside watching and giving advice. "Make the wall thicker there," one said, pointing with his stick. "Don't forget to tie the roof tight before the next rain," another reminded. Even in their weakness, their wisdom guided everyone. The school building, which had once been full of mud, was now clean and ready to open. The blackboard was wiped, the broken benches were repaired with wooden planks, and the walls were painted again with leftover whitewash. When the children walked in for the first time, their faces lit up. They carried no books yet, but they carried hope. The teacher stood at the door with tears in her eyes as she watched them sit down, their laughter bouncing off the walls. For a moment, it felt like life had returned. In the relief camp, the volunteers were slowly packing their things. They had been living among the townspeople for weeks, sleeping on the same floors and eating from the same plates. They had become part of the family. When they said they might leave soon, the people grew quiet. One woman said softly, "You came to help strangers, but you are leaving as our brothers and sisters." The volunteers smiled, promising they would come back to visit. They exchanged hugs, shared food one last time, and some even cried quietly, not wanting to say goodbye. The community had learned something beautiful during those days, that real strength comes from togetherness. When people stood shoulder to shoulder, no storm could break them. So even as the volunteers left, their spirit remained. The people of the town had become rescuers of their own. Day by day, the place changed. The market reopened. Small stalls appeared again, selling vegetables, handmade items, and even sweets. The smell of fried snacks drifted through the air, mixing with the laughter of children chasing each other down the lanes. Someone had written a message on a wall with chalk, "We rise again." It was simple but powerful. Everyone who walked past smiled when they saw it. Evenings were now peaceful. Families gathered outside their homes, talking and sharing stories. Some lit small lamps as the sun went down, saying prayers of thanks. They didn't pray for wealth or luxury. They prayed for peace, safety, and for the strength to never forget what they had learned, the value of human kindness. One evening, after a long day of rebuilding, the young volunteer who had stayed behind climbed the same small hill where he had once seen the floodwaters cover everything. This time the view was completely different. The river shone like glass under the sunset. Smoke rose gently from the rebuilt homes. Children's voices carried through the breeze. He smiled, knowing that the town had done what many thought impossible. It had come back to life through pure courage. Down below, an elderly man sat near a half-built house, holding a small plant in his hands. The soil was still wet and heavy, but he dug a small hole and placed the plant inside. When someone asked why he was planting it now, when so much else still needed to be fixed, he said, "This tree will grow with us. Someday when people sit under its shade, they'll remember that we rebuilt this place with our own hands." It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. There were still hard days, of course. Some people had lost loved ones and couldn't bear the memories. Others struggled to find work again because their shops or tools were gone. But no one was left alone. Whenever someone felt lost, the community stood around them, offering food, comfort, or simply quiet company. One woman who had lost her home was given a small corner in another family's house. "Until yours is ready, this is your home," they told her. She cried, not from sadness but from the overwhelming kindness she felt. The unity that had grown from tragedy now became their greatest treasure. Even the smallest things began to feel precious again. The sound of the first rooster crowing in the morning, the taste of freshly cooked rice, the cool touch of evening wind after a day of hard work. These moments reminded everyone of what really mattered. Not what they had lost, but what they still had: each other. News of the town's recovery began to spread. People from nearby villages came to see the place that had once been drowned, but was now alive again. Journalists visited and spoke to the locals, asking how they managed to rebuild so fast. An old woman told them simply, "Because we didn't wait for hope. We created it." Her words appeared in newspapers the next day, inspiring people across the country. In the evenings, when the work was done, people gathered near the riverside. The water was calm now, reflecting the soft glow of lanterns. They would sit there, talking quietly about the future, about rebuilding the market, repairing the bridge, replanting the fields. Some sang songs, others shared jokes, and a few simply closed their eyes listening to the peaceful sound of the flowing river. That river, once the cause of their pain, had now become a symbol of healing. One night, as the moonlight shimmered on the water, a young boy asked his father, "Will the flood come again?" The father looked at the river and said, "Maybe. No one can stop nature, but this time we'll be ready, and even if it does, we know we'll face it together." The boy nodded and smiled, holding his father's hand a little tighter. That moment said everything. Fear was gone, replaced by faith. Weeks turned into months. The fields began to show signs of life again. Farmers worked long hours, planting seeds in the moist soil. Green shoots rose from the earth, proof that the land, like its people, was capable of recovery. The same hands that had once pulled survivors from the floodwater were now planting crops for the future. It was as if the earth itself was thanking them for not giving up. A small celebration was planned when the first harvest came. People danced, sang, and shared food under the open sky. The children ran around with flowers in their hands. The elders clapped in rhythm, and for the first time in a long while, the sound of pure joy filled the air. The flood had once brought tears, but now it brought a deeper understanding of life's beauty. As night fell, one of the volunteers who had returned for a visit looked around and said, "This place doesn't look broken anymore. It looks stronger than ever." A local smiled and replied, "It's not just the town that's stronger, it's the people," and he was right. What had begun as a cry for help had turned into a story of courage, unity, and love. When the stars appeared, shining bright and countless above, people sat together by the river one last time that night. The old man who had planted the tree earlier looked at it. It had grown a little taller already. "See that?" he said softly. "That's hope." Everyone nodded, smiling quietly, their hearts full. The flood had tested them in every way, but it had also revealed something powerful. the true strength of humanity. They had learned that walls can fall, but people can rise, that even when nature shows its fury, kindness can be an even greater force, and so, in that quiet town that had once been drowning, there now stood something unshakable, a community built not just from bricks and wood, but from trust, love, and the belief that no matter what happens, humanity will always find its way home. Days had turned into weeks and weeks into months. The town that once lay drowned under muddy waters was now alive, filled with sounds of life, laughter, and the rhythm of rebuilding. It wasn't just a place anymore. It had become a symbol of hope. Every brick placed, every seed planted, and every hand extended had turned this once-forgotten land into a living reminder that humanity, when united, can heal any wound. The story of the town began to spread far and wide. News reporters who had first come to show images of the disaster now returned to show something very different. Smiling faces, rebuilt homes, and hands that still worked together even when the worst was over. The same camera lenses that once captured tears were now capturing hope. The whole nation began to notice. People who had once watched helplessly from far away now saw what their kindness had created. A new beginning. One morning, a news team visited the riverside, where life had started again. They filmed the children walking to school, their bags swinging on their shoulders, their laughter echoing across the quiet fields. The teacher greeted them with a smile, saying, "We begin again just like the sunrise." Those simple words touched millions who watched on their screens. Across the country, people felt proud, not because of what they gave, but because they saw how humanity had bloomed in the hardest soil. Letters began to arrive at the small local office, handwritten letters, colorful drawings from school children, and messages that said things like, "You showed us what real courage means," and "We believe in kindness again because of you." Each envelope carried warmth, proof that compassion travels further than any storm ever could. The townspeople kept those letters safely, reading them over and over whenever they felt tired. It gave them strength to keep moving forward. As time passed, the volunteers who had once come to help began returning, not because there was still disaster, but because they missed the people they had helped. They were greeted like family. The hugs were tighter, the smiles wider, and the sense of togetherness even stronger. One of them said, "When I first came here, I came to save lives. But now I come here to feel alive." That single line summed up what everyone felt, that goodness had created something more powerful than any flood could wash away. The old man who had once sat quietly, under a broken roof now, spent his mornings near the small tree he had planted. It had grown taller, its green leaves dancing in the wind. He often sat there with a cup of tea, watching the children play nearby. When visitors came, he would tell them the story, not of the flood, but of what came after it. He would say softly, "We thought we had lost everything, but we found something far more precious, each other." People listened with quiet hearts, some with tears in their eyes. His voice carried the truth of survival, that love and unity are stronger than fear and loss. The town had changed, but so had the people. They had become more caring, more understanding, more connected. If anyone fell sick, the entire neighborhood helped. If someone built a house, others came to lend a hand. Every small act became a shared act. The flood had destroyed the walls between homes, but it had also destroyed the invisible walls between hearts. That was the true miracle. Then one day, something unexpected happened. A letter came from the capital city, an invitation from a humanitarian organization. They wanted representatives from the town to come and share their story at a national gathering about unity and disaster recovery. At first, the people were shy. "What can we say?" someone asked. "We only did what anyone would do." But others encouraged them. "No," they said. "The world needs to hear that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they care for each other." And so, a small group traveled to the city, the old man, the young volunteer, the teacher, and a few others. They had never been to such a big place before. The streets were wide, the buildings tall, and the lights bright. Yet even there, their humble story stood out. When they walked on stage and spoke about how the flood had united them, the hall fell silent. The old man said, "The water came like a monster, but kindness came like a storm. And it was kindness that won." When he finished speaking, the audience stood up in applause. Some wiped their tears. People came forward afterward to shake their hands and thank them. Journalists asked for interviews, and the story of the town that rose again spread across newspapers, television, and the internet. But the people from the town didn't see themselves as heroes. They just saw themselves as humans who did what needed to be done, together. When they returned home, they were greeted by cheers and smiles. The whole town gathered by the riverside that evening. Someone brought out drums, others sang songs, and laughter filled the air. It wasn't just a celebration of survival. It was a celebration of humanity. The river, calm and shining under the moonlight, seemed to flow along with their joy. As night settled in, people sat quietly by the river, remembering how far they had come. The young volunteer looked at the reflection of the stars on the water and said softly, "It's strange, isn't it? The same river that scared us once now feels like a friend." The old man nodded. "Because we learned how to live with it, not against it," he replied. "Just like we learned to live with each other." Nearby, children were playing, their laughter echoing in the cool breeze. They built small boats from leaves and twigs and set them floating down the river, each carrying a small candle. The flickering lights drifted away one by one, symbolizing the pain they were letting go of, and the hope that now guided their lives. Everyone watched in silence. It was a simple sight, yet so deeply beautiful that some couldn't stop smiling through their tears. In the days that followed, the town became a place others visited to learn. Students came to study how people rebuilt with unity, instead of waiting for outside help. Reporters returned not to film tragedy but to film inspiration. The world had seen destruction before, but now it saw how powerful human compassion could be. And that was something worth remembering. The people didn't change who they were. They still worked hard in the fields, cooked together, helped one another, and sang by the river at night. But now they did it with a quiet pride. A pride not born from fame, but from the peace of knowing they had stood together through the darkest times and found light again. Seasons changed. The flood became a story of the past, yet it was never forgotten. Every year, when the rains returned, the people remembered those days. But instead of fear, there was preparation and calm. The same riverbanks that had once broken now had strong barriers built by their own hands. But even stronger were the barriers built in their hearts, the barriers against despair, loneliness, and division. One evening, a soft drizzle began to fall. The sound of raindrops on rooftops made everyone pause. For a moment, silence filled the air as memories came rushing back. But then, instead of panic, people smiled. Some stood outside, letting the rain wash over them. The old man raised his face to the sky and whispered, "We are not afraid anymore." Children danced in the rain, laughing and splashing in puddles. The adults joined in, clapping, singing, and celebrating life itself. That night, the town glowed not from lanterns or lights, but from something far brighter, the warmth of human connection. The flood had once been a story of loss, but now it was a story of rebirth. A story of how when people call for help, the world can answer with open arms. A story that proved that kindness travels faster than any wave, and that no storm, no matter how strong, can ever drown the human spirit. Years later, when people from other towns asked how they had survived such a terrible disaster, the townspeople would smile and say, "We didn't just survive, we became one." And if someone asked what gave them hope when everything was gone, they would simply reply, "Humanity did." The story of that town continued to inspire many, spreading far beyond borders and time. And though the waters had long gone, the message they left behind stayed forever. That sometimes when the world seems broken, all it takes is one call for help and one act of kindness to start a storm of humanity that changes everything. And so, the story ends not with sorrow but with strength, not with tears but with gratitude. They called for aid, and humanity came like a storm, and that storm, made of compassion, courage, and love, would forever be remembered as the greatest force the world had ever seen.